We watch the most untouchable icons of our generation trade the pinnacle of European football for court summons, bankruptcy declarations, and the quiet desperation of addiction clinics. For years, the massive institutions that solemnly swore to protect these players secretly exploited their absolute peak earning periods, only to completely abandon them the second their physical utility finally expired. From Ronaldinho posing for tragic mugshots in a stark Paraguayan holding cell, to Keith Gillespie watching £7 million violently vanish into ruthless bookmakers' pockets, the immense wealth that was supposed to permanently secure their dynasties became the exact mechanism of their total humiliating ruin. Paul Gascoigne, Diego Maradona, Paul Merson, Wes Brown, the legendary names defined our weekends and filled the massive stadiums, but the grim off-pitch reality completely destroyed their carefully curated public legacies. The insulated dressing room quietly hides the internal rot. The powerful agents enthusiastically encourage high spending, and we only clearly see the absolute, terrifying collapse when the guaranteed money finally dries up and the official legal notices are heavily served. The overarching system deeply convinced them the massive weekly wages would miraculously last forever, aggressively pushing high-end luxury lifestyles while deliberately withholding the essential financial literacy required to physically survive retirement. They were universally elevated to the protected status of modern royalty, but the inevitable fall was always devastating, horribly public, and fundamentally asymmetric. Behind the heavily closed doors of elite professional football, a deeply systemic pattern of quiet enabling and massive institutional exploitation thrived unchecked, leaving the players utterly exposed to their own worst self-destructive impulses. The undeniable, brutal truth is that the beautiful game rapidly chews up its greatest heroes, and when the terrifying addiction and massive tax bills inevitably arrive, the calculated silence from their former corporate benefactors is truly sickeningly deafening. Paul Gascoigne famously described his agonizing post-career reality as violently hitting rock bottom. But the crushing collapse was never a single catastrophic event. It was a relentless, grinding erosion of a deeply vulnerable, universally adored national hero. Once he officially retired from the pitch, the highly structured daily routine instantly vanished. The massive, adoring crowds completely disappeared, and the truly deafening silence of normal civilian life triggered a devastating, long-term cycle of severe depression. Alcohol wasn't just a temporary, incidental coping mechanism for the lost superstar. It was the incredibly powerful engine, aggressively pulling his dwindling finances, his closest personal relationships, and his fundamental psychological stability into absolute, irreversible chaos. For years, he desperately hid the true, terrifying severity of the internal struggle. But the fragile public facade finally, completely shattered when heavy court filings, repeated desperate rehab admissions, and a highly publicized, suspended sentence for drunk driving in 2010 violently exposed the tragic depth of his fall. The permanent legal mark wasn't merely a brief lapse in basic judgment, it was the highly tangible consequence of an unforgiving industry that completely abandons its biggest stars the exact moment their physical utility expires. He earned staggering millions during his absolute prime, but the unyielding addiction totally hijacked his personal autonomy, directly leading to catastrophic financial mismanagement that systematically eroded every single layer of his remaining safety net. We fondly remember the magical skills and the unmatched flair on the pitch, but the agonizing human cost heavily concealed behind the sensationalized tabloid headlines reveals a profound, unforgivable structural failure. The massive organizations that happily built immense generational wealth off his extraordinary, once-in-a-lifetime talent offered absolutely zero long-term psychological protection, leaving him to face the crushing, suffocating weight of systemic exploitation entirely alone when the bright stadium lights finally went out forever. Diego Maradona constantly faced a terrifying, invisible opponent in Italy that no amount of unprecedented genius, breathtaking technical flair, or sheer on-pitch improvisation could ever successfully outmaneuver. The relentless Italian tax authorities aggressively pursued him for 3 grueling, exhausting decades, creating a suffocating, permanent shadow that violently stalked his every single movement long after he finally departed his beloved Napoli. His dedicated legal team adamantly claimed the initial massive debt was officially canceled, but the powerful government institutions immediately denied it, forcefully locking him into a 30-year bureaucratic labyrinth where his personal assets were constantly threatened with aggressive, immediate seizure. This wasn't just a heavy, annoying financial burden. It was a truly crushing psychological torment that systematically compounded year after agonizing year, brutally turning his post-playing existence into an endless, deeply stressful series of high-stakes court battles. He miraculously brought unprecedented glory and massive immense wealth to the struggling city, yet the unforgiving governing bodies violently squeezed him for decades, perfectly demonstrating the brutal, terrifying asymmetry between an isolated player and the overwhelming power of the state. The ultimate, intensely bitter irony is that Italy's highest legal court only formally cleared him of the massive tax evasion charges in 2024, tragically years after the legendary icon had already passed away. We universally celebrate the historic, glittering trophies and the sheer, unmatched brilliance he brought to the beautiful game, but his deeply complex legacy is permanently entangled with a ruthless institutional pursuit that adamantly refused to ever let him live in peace. The relentless, decades-long legal persecution stands as a stark, horrifying reminder that even the most deeply revered sporting deity remains entirely, hopelessly vulnerable to the crushing, unyielding weight of governmental bureaucracy. The massive global stage offered absolutely zero institutional immunity when Ronaldinho's official passports were abruptly, violently seized, permanently stripping a world-renowned footballing deity of his fundamental personal liberty. The rigid Brazilian courts initially made it official by heavily restricting his international travel over deeply unpaid environmental fines. But the terrifying situation rapidly escalated into unprecedented global chaos when he quietly crossed the southern border into Paraguay. Armed authorities decisively detained him and his brother, firmly claiming they presented heavily counterfeit passports and blatantly false identification cards completely loaded with entirely bogus personal details. The stark, highly public juxtaposition was profoundly jarring. A legendary player globally synonymous with pure, unadulterated joy and boundless creativity suddenly ensnared in a massive, multi-country legal crisis, forcefully forced to trade the massive adulation of Camp Nou for the grim, terrifying reality of a foreign holding cell. It violently exposed the brutal, undeniable truth that massive cultural influence and truly historic talent provide zero actual protection against strict international law and incredibly rigid bureaucratic enforcement. Every agonizing day spent under intense legal investigation systematically dismantled the long-held, comforting illusion of superstar invulnerability, proving conclusively that the legendary fame easily earned on the pitch cannot successfully shield you from the severe, highly public consequences of forged administrative paperwork. We watch the ultimate, beloved artist violently reduced to a mere accused litigant, a sobering, truly frightening demonstration that the elite legal frameworks will gladly humiliate the absolute best to strongly maintain their unquestioned systemic authority. The brilliant, infectious magic faded entirely, quickly replaced by the harsh, unforgiving, blinding glare of an unrelenting international justice system that firmly refuses to recognize past sporting glory. Keith Gillespie legitimately earned a staggering £7 million during his remarkable, highly successful career, and he was tragically forced to watch almost every single penny of it get swallowed completely by ruthless bookmakers and utterly disastrous private investments. He was comfortably taking home an incredibly massive £14,000 every single week, but the deeply compulsive cycle of constant, high-stakes betting eroded his massive financial safety net significantly faster than anyone inside the club could ever possibly comprehend. By 2010, the profound, staggering losses had mounted so relentlessly that they dragged him completely into brutal public bankruptcy, brutally leaving him with absolutely nothing but a devastating, highly visible personal cautionary tale. He heavily titled his shockingly candid autobiography, How Not to Be a Football Millionaire, brutally stripping away all the fabricated, glittering glamour and exposing exactly how the constant thrill of the high-stakes wager completely hijacked his basic discipline and utterly derailed his entire future. The deeply insulated dressing room culture heavily normalized the extreme financial risk, but the agonizing, crushing isolation of losing was profoundly personal, characterized by incredibly deep denial, fleeting temporary highs, and truly crushing, inescapable emotional remorse. It powerfully stands as a stark, entirely undeniable confirmation that massive Premier League wages only provide a highly fragile illusion of permanent security when unchecked. Dangerous addictive behavior actively dictates your daily personal decisions. The deeply predatory gambling industry happily extracted his generational wealth, perfectly demonstrating how the overarching, deeply cynical system heavily capitalizes on highly vulnerable young athletes who mistakenly believe their peak athletic earning power will miraculously last forever. Imagine securely holding an incredibly massive £800,000 pension, the ultimate, completely guaranteed safety net for your family's long-term future, and desperately throwing every last cent of it directly into a compulsive, entirely destructive betting binge. Paul Merson didn't just casually spend his hard-earned money. He aggressively, frantically gambled it all away in a relentless, agonizing spree heavily fueled by alcohol and the utterly desperate psychological need to frantically chase his massive, mounting losses. The incredibly intense compulsion constantly demanded significantly bigger financial risks, quickly turning every highly fleeting win into a highly dangerous illusion that merely masked the rapid, complete unraveling of his personal home, his deepest friendships, and his fundamental long-term stability. He vividly, terrifyingly described the brutal experience as exactly like a man desperately drowning, reaching wildly for absolutely anything to somehow keep him afloat, only to aggressively pull himself right back under the dark water again and again. The brutal, unrelenting addiction didn't just completely drain his extensive bank accounts, it systematically, violently chipped away at his core self-worth, completely destroying his closest personal relationships and heavily turning a lifetime of celebrated sporting achievements into a dark, incredibly painful backdrop for total personal catastrophe. We constantly look at the incredible, massive millions these truly elite players easily earn. But Merson's tragic, highly public saga proves definitively that extreme wealth quickly becomes a lethal weapon of massive self-destruction when the fragile mind is heavily compromised and the essential club support structures completely fail the isolated player. Wes Brown violently fell into a completely different, highly insidious psychological trap, one built entirely on the massive, utterly suffocating social pressure to desperately keep up with superstar teammates secretly earning 5 or 6 times his actual club salary. The desperate, constant, incredibly stressful attempt to maintain a totally fabricated image of financial parity drove him blindly into purchasing incredibly massive luxury properties and high-end, deeply complex investments that his actual monthly cash flow could never realistically sustain. We clearly watched the classic, tragically predictable trajectory of young professional athletes completely unfold. Massive locker room income mismatches, intense daily peer comparison, hyper-inflated, highly dangerous lifestyle choices, and the truly inevitable crushing financial crash. The crucial, incredibly massive money that should have securely, safely funded his quiet retirement dissipated entirely under the immense crushing weight of heavily ill-advised, purely ego-driven commitments, brutally leaving him completely, hopelessly exposed when the peak earning years abruptly and permanently ended. It absolutely wasn't simply a case of sheer personal negligence. It was a profound, deeply systemic behavioral failure, fueled directly by a highly toxic professional culture that constantly glorifies incredibly extravagant spending and brutally punishes any outward sign of basic financial restraint. When the massive, highly lucrative club contracts finally stop arriving, the incredibly expensive, deeply entrenched personal habits remain rigidly fixed, and the resulting terrifying, massive gap between elite social expectation and harsh financial reality drags even the most successful, highly decorated defenders straight into the unforgiving reality of bankruptcy court and total public humiliation. Tony Adams bravely stood up and finally laid the brutal, incredibly undeniable reality completely bare. The crushing financial crisis heavily plaguing the beautiful game absolutely isn't an isolated anomaly. It's a full-blown, incredibly dangerous systemic epidemic. He heavily revealed that highly destructive gambling has now securely overtaken alcohol and drugs, massively accounting for a staggering 70% of the deeply desperate athletes currently coming directly through his incredibly busy recovery clinic. The highly visible, incredibly noisy pub visits and deeply destructive public binge drinking of the past decades have been quietly, heavily, systematically replaced by deeply addictive digital stakes. massive live match odds, and predatory casino apps securely embedded right into the highly isolated players' personal smartphones. We are actively, terrifyingly witnessing a massive, highly dangerous generational shift where the psychological addiction is incredibly stealthier, brutally striking highly vulnerable players right before critical kickoffs and quietly, ruthlessly eroding their fragile mental health, essential team cohesion, and necessary long-term financial stability. The incredibly small, early digital wins perfectly, incredibly dangerously lure them in, matching exactly the highly destructive behavioral patterns Wayne Rooney openly deeply described regarding his own massive gambling debts. But the completely frictionless, deeply hidden digital access dramatically accelerates the total financial devastation, rapidly stripping away massive, deeply unearned fortunes before anyone inside the heavily guarded club structure even notices the underlying, terrifying problem. Terry, Icardi, Giggs, Gascoigne, Merson, Brown. The distinct, highly visible eras constantly change. The specific destructive vices repeatedly shift. But the deeply vulnerable core psychological foundation remains utterly, terrifyingly identical across every single generation of elite professional football. We've intensely, powerlessly watched these massive, incredibly destructive scandals completely unfold across 20 long, highly revealing years. Truly knowing the dark, highly repetitive pattern long before the official court documents and deeply tragic autobiographies finally confirmed our very worst suspicions. The incredibly pervasive, deeply entrenched cultural normalization of extreme financial risk, tightly combined with incredibly short-term peak massive incomes that quickly evaporate instantly overnight, perfectly, brutally guarantees that the next completely unprepared young generation is currently walking completely blind into the exact same devastating trap. Will the incredibly massive, highly profitable governing authorities actually implement robust, deeply protective digital monitoring? Or will they simply look away and happily let the highly destructive epidemic quietly entrench itself even further while another entire roster of truly beloved icons spirals into complete, absolutely irreversible ruin? The absolute, truly deafening silence from the very top perfectly, undeniably confirms they constantly, aggressively prioritize the lucrative, highly polished brand over the deeply vulnerable human being. The vital, heavily anticipated weekend fixtures rapidly approach. The incredibly massive, highly lucrative stadiums loudly fill up once again, and the exceptionally dangerous, perfectly hidden destructive cycle just quietly, permanently restarts.